Welcome to Be Bold America. I'm your host, Jill Cody, and today our topic is, who owns democracy? As today's interview guest, Dr. Charles Derber, stated, quote, severe problems of democracy are much in the news, but actually go way back to the beginning of the country. We now want to look at how both the deep state and American fascist forces played a key role from the very beginning of the United States. We will be discussing with him the two deep states of cultural and ideological ideals, as well as their clashing trade and other economic interests that led to an increasingly troubled relationship, ultimately causing a violent divorce and a military destruction of the Confederate deep state. But it did not end the enduring legacy of both deep states that shapes our nation's divisive politics today. A mega conspiratorial concept is that there is a deep state. But could there be a very real deeper state that has been evident throughout history going way back to the founding of American democracy? We'll find out. We have big things to do. Our interview guest is Dr. Charles Derber, who is professor of sociology at Boston College and has written 26 books on politics, democracy, fascism, corporations, capitalism, climate change, war, the culture wars, culture and conversation, and social change. He writes for and has been reviewed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Truth Out, and other leading media. His books are translated into 14 languages and include Dying for Capitalism, Welcome to the Revolution, Moving Beyond Fear, Sociopathic Society, A People's Sociology of the United States, and Capitalism, Should You Buy It? However, today we'll be discussing his most recent book, Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. Welcome back to Big Bold America, Dr. Derber.
Hi, Jill.
Hi.
Good to be back with you. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you, too. You were on the show exactly the very same weekend a year ago talking about Dying for Capitalism. You know, I did want to say about Dying for Capitalism that I still see on my podcast analytics people listening to that show. So I want to let you know that.
That's great. Yeah,
and that
we had a good conversation.
We had a great conversation, and the audio is also maybe heard on my Be Bold America page at this station's website, dated 12/3/23. So now you've written another brilliant book. And to get started, I thought I'd just ask, Trump and the right appear to have introduced the phrase deep state, but the left has long referred to the ruling class, the power elite, the military-industrial complex. How do you define deep state and differentiate between these things?
Yeah. Well, it's a really important question, I think, because deep state is going to be much in the news. You know, Trump kind of ran on the idea that there was a deep state that was basically taking over the country and destroying the true American dream and working against ordinary Americans. And he was going to, the second Trump term was an effort to eliminate this deep state and bring power back to the people. Now, I know a lot of people entirely dismiss this on the left and progressives, but as you said in your intro, progressives and the left have long had this idea that there is a group of people or groups of people who have a lot of power but are not elected and who exercise a great deal of control over the country and over elected officials. So it's worth, and that's what in this book, Who Owns Democracy, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the real deep state, that there's long been an understanding that there are people and groups of people who are not elected who have very dominant control. Now, Trump says this deep state is largely the federal bureaucracy, the civil servants, mostly he regards as liberal, who, you know, in the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Justice Department, or the FCC, who basically are supposed to be regulating business and protecting people from, to make sure that public well-being is enforced. And Trump views these people as having appropriated the powers of government for a liberal or, Marxist elite agenda. And, of course, it's interesting that Trump won partly because polls are showing that the great majority of people in America do believe there is a deep state. But whether they actually agree with what Trump is talking about, whether that's the real deep state, if you mean by a deep state a group of people or unelected leaders who are basically running the country in their own interests, that idea, as I said, and as you said in your intro, goes back a very long time. It goes back in the left to Marx, who said that in capitalist countries, the famous quote is that the government is simply the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, meaning basically the community that Trump himself is part of, the corporate elites, people with a lot of money, running big companies and billionaires, who have long exercised, overwhelming power in the state, even though they're not typically elected officials. They have closer elections, they do lobbying, and they use all kinds of ways in which their money goes to determining both who the Democrats and the Republicans tend to put up for office and what the lobbying, the people who write our laws are largely corporate lobbyists. They're more, for example, drug company pharmacists in Washington than there are representatives in Washington, elected representatives. So, and Americans are readily aware that big money plays a very disproportionate and damaging role in the country. But Trump, when he talks about the deep state, does simply completely leaves out this huge group of largely unelected people who, in our view, constitute the deeper real state, the corporate elites, the capitalist classes, the people with large amounts of money and political influence who, ironically, are going to be when you think about Elon Musk and, the people that he's now appointing for his treasury and other, particularly financial and economic positions, these are the deep state people. So it's kind of ironic that Trump won an election saying, I'm going to drain the swamp, work for ordinary workers who voted for him, a pretty large number in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, only to find that they're being presented with a new government of these big corporate power that Trump in some appeared to be railing against. So that's, I think that the idea that there is a real deep state is important to talk about because Trump is going to be constantly talking about the deep state, and if we can sort of join that conversation and help sort of strip back for everybody to see who are the real unelected people who are shaping both Trump's regime and, have long shaped the direction of the country. I think we have the possibility of at least educating the public to some degree about the real nature of power in America. As you said, Jill, this goes right back to the beginning of the country because we argue in the book that the North was kind of an emerging corporate deep state of northern merchants who were people like, John Adams and people who signed it, John Hancock, very wealthy white men from the North who were part of the founding elite in the North. And they ruled in this deep state based on class, which is, economic position that they shared, great wealth. But in the South, you had another elite of white men, a different, as you sort of hinted at, a different southern deep state of men who were names like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who also were part of they when before the Revolution, they kind of dominated in the colonies, and after the revolution, the same people ran the show. It asked you something about was this really a revolution, when the same people who were basically managing the country before the revolution actually didn't afterward. But the Southern deep state part of it were these men who basically believed in a caste rather than class rule. Caste, the subtitle of this book, Who Owns Democracy, is The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. So class in a capitalist society, of course, has to do with money and your economic state. Are you an owner of money and capital, or are you working for that group? Caste is a concept of either a biological or either viewed as a condition you can't change, whether it's your race or your gender. Typically, though, the race and gender are typically the most important caste positions. And, of course, in the Southern Confederacy, the idea was that race was absolutely central to citizenship. You know, the Constitution was written with the Southern deep state very much in mind, and they defined slaves as 3/5 of a person. The whole organization of Southern society was based on caste rule, that white males were the only people really capable of, managing and running America. So in our view, the revolution brought together, it was kind of like a troubled marriage, because the caste deep state of the South and the class deep state of the North came together with shared interest in sort of getting more independence from Britain and wanting to be able to expand westward for their own interests and, not have to pay taxes to the British Parliament and Crown. So there was kind of this marriage of caste and class deep state, which was very troubled because even though the North and South shared an interest of, breaking from Britain and being able to benefit together from westward expansion and freedom from colonial rule, they really differed, and this difference became very noteworthy over time because a class society, the Northern class deep state, really seeks a manufacturing industrial society, which is based on the legitimating idea that, in a class, you're not born in, presumably biologically stuck in your class. The idea of class is if you work hard, you can get ahead. The American dream got built on this Northern idea of class, whereas the Southern idea of caste pointed to a very different kind of society, an agrarian society, which was based on, slave labor and had a very different idea of what the good life was like and what the land should be used for. And so, like many troubled marriages, these two deep states that sort of came together to found America over, 50 or 60 years, their differences began to get more acute. They had different ideas about what the land and the West should be used for, what taxes should be for, what trade policy should be like. The Southerners wanted to sell slave labor, cotton cheaply to Britain. The North wanted to have higher tariffs and taxes, which are much in the news. So essentially, like many troubled marriages, if you sort of understand the foundation of the United States as these two kind of ruling elites with very different ideas of how the world should work, they ultimately became more and more antagonistic and, erupted into a divorce in the Civil War.
And became a civil war. Yes.
Yeah.
You are listening well, let me take a break. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. I'm speaking with Dr. Charles Derber, professor of sociology at Boston College and author of 26 books, the most recent of which we're discussing today is Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Did you know that 6 corporations own 90% of the media in the United States? Isn't it about time we own some too? KSQD 90.7 FM, your community radio station, your voice, your concerns. Go to www.ksqd.org to get involved and support locally owned grassroots community media. K-Squid, KSQD FM.
Hello, K-Squid listeners. I'm Tom Hartman, and each weekday at 4 p.m., I bring you a different perspective on the news than you're likely to hear on most media outlets. Please join me on KSQD Santa Cruz, your ink spot on the dial for the Tom Hartman program, heard now for the first time ever in the Monterey Bay area at 90.7 FM, weekdays at 4 p.m. That's progressive talking conversation with me, Tom Hartman, weekdays at 4 p.m. on KSQD 90.7 FM. Tag, you're it.
We're back. Would you like a friend to hear this interview on Who Owns Democracy? Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Subscribe for free from your favorite podcast platform, or listen to the show at Be Bold America's homepage on the ksqd.org website. In addition, KSQD is proud to announce that we now have a mobile app so that you may listen to your favorite shows anytime and anywhere from your smartphone. You can download it from the App Store or visit ksqd.org/KSQDAPP. Now, Dr. Derber, one of the things that I first thought when I heard that phrase deep state, because I do think Trump and the right introduced that, is, oh, here's another bumper sticker that, 2 words to get people to, oh my God, what is that? And I originally thought of it as, the federal government, demonizing the federal government that is us, actually. We elect people, and we've created this government over the centuries. But then I also thought that the Supreme Court, and I wanted to get your opinion on this, because it seems to me that the deep state that actually Trump is part of, that power elite, was created. Originally there was the Lewis Powell Memo Manifesto in 1971. Listeners to this show know who he is. And then Powell was put on the Supreme Court and helped pass Buckley versus Vallejo, which made money a form of speech. Then there was Boston and Belletti, where free speech rights were given to corporations. They have a lot of money. And then I think it was McCutcheon and FEC, where individuals were given unlimited ability to spend money. And then Citizens United and corporate personhood. It seems to me that people with the most money has the most speech, but they also have the most power. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the Supreme Court and their being part of the deep state.
Yeah, well, so the deep state, after the Civil War, the North basically won. I mean, the sort of race-based kind of power didn't go away, what I call fascist ghosts.
Right, I love that term. Right, yeah. You mentioned that often, that it goes beyond the ghosts go beyond the American South, is what you were referring to, these fascist ghosts.
So when the North won, what you described, actually the Supreme Court's complicity with big money began, in my view, most importantly, in the Santa Clara decision, 1876, which
corporate personhood
defined corporations as people. Yes, and
actually, that was a head note. It was not a decision of the Supreme Court. It was a head note.
You're right. You're absolutely right. But it was then used by by that court and later courts to basically give more speech rights and other, rights to corporations. And by the time of Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Carnegie in the 1890s, you had a bunch of new billionaires, essentially. Those guys in today's money would be worth billions of dollars. And they look a lot like the people Trump is appointing. And they were clearly kind of the northern, capitalist deep state sort of triumphed. And they didn't get rid of Jim Crow and the kind of what I'm calling the fascist ghosts, which were rooted in the southern states and then spread out to many parts of the country, particularly rural areas. But they really did with the Santa Clara Act, and then all through American history in the 20th century, the Supreme Court played an important role in kind of reinforcing the constitutional idea that money was a sort of legitimate foundation for speech and political influence and lobbying, and all that stuff just spread. And
which is beyond belief to me, because it's against common sense. I don't hear my wallet talking to me. It's so against common sense, and yet even the corporate personhood is, and that wasn't even a law. It just was a head note by a corporate clerk, and then the Supreme Court just acted on it as if it was a law, and we've gotten into this deeper state of structure that the Supreme Court has created that I find I just don't know how we can unravel all this. But I'm sorry, I'm ranting.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Well, no, I think the court's decision, this past summer, the presidential immunity decision and the Chevron
doctrine. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they are. So you're right that the court is, in a way, an important sector of the deep state, the corporate deep state, because they really are largely, setting the road forward with how Trump is going to be able to use the billionaires who are, whether it's Elon Musk and his, the new Treasury Secretary, who is a Wall Street guy worth billions. He's got about 5 billionaires already in the top economic positions of his cabinet. So
yes,
it's kind of ironic, Jill, that in the name of opposing the deep state, because Trump ran and won on this idea that there was this deep state that was, taking away money and rights of people, and is in fact right at the center of building the very deep state that he was militating against. I mean, this is going to be one of the most shameless corporate regimes of modern times. I mean, we're seeing a kind of crony capitalism where, people like Musk are getting literally billions of dollars in government contracts in exchange for millions of dollars that he's giving to Trump. And we're seeing a bunch of business interests, big oil. Trump said, if you pay me $1 billion, I'll make sure that all the drilling and all the land that you want, all the deregulation of all these ridiculous climate things that he was talking about, we'll take those away. And he will.
Yes.
Going back to our dying for capitalism, if you're concerned about climate change and environment, this Trump, I think the most immediate or one of the most immediate and certainly the most dangerous of all the things Trump is doing is destroying the possibility of, the climate crisis is in a particularly
emergency state.
It's really just become, the last 10 years have been the hottest 10 years in a row. 2024 is now even hotter than 2023, which was the hottest year in history. So climate is a pure externality, and it's an external force. You don't have to worry about if you're a corporation or a big money guy. And we know that Trump believes that climate change is a hoax. So he's going to gut the Environmental Protection Agency, make sure that none of these regulations, and the Chevron doctrine is going to help him do that gutting and do that deregulating.
Well, he started that gutting. Let's just for a second on the EPA. He started that gutting in his first term. The person who he had leading that agency separated the scientists out and moved them to other cities than Washington, D.C. And some didn't go because they didn't want to move their families. Right. So he already gutted a lot of the scientists out of the EPA. And now that Trump has won, and what you've been talking about are some of the threats that he poses, so much for American democracy's concept of man is above the law, no man is above the law, he appears to be. What other threats are going to happen with Trump and our democracy? I know the climate crisis. I'm very concerned about the climate crisis and nothing being done, and actually things being against doing anything that will help.
Right. Well, I think the broader issues are, as you say, how power is going to be exercised, and back to this idea of the deep state. I think basically, in the name of defeating the Trump state, Trump is basically taking away all the constraints on the real deep state, the sort of regulations and, controls on executive power and emergency, executive orders that help. I mean, if Trump wants to immediately make an executive order opening all coastal land to drilling and all public, much of the public park and wilderness area to that, he can do that by executive order, and he's going to have his very rich buddies right around him. And so it's kind of a great irony, Jill, that in the name of defeating the deep state, Trump is actually feeding it and fueling it and openly, creating these transactions that are pretty shameless and public, and allowing the real deep state to enrich itself in ways that were almost, we've always had, as I say, this has a long history. So Trumpism, either both in its corporate dimensions and its more racial, white Christian nationalist kind of, this is the neo-fascist, American fascist kind of thread of American history. They're not new. All these things have been, since the Gilded Age, money has ruled pretty unequivocally, and race has played a major role. Trump is bringing them together in a more kind of, Reagan started this.
Yes.
Because Reagan, people know that Reagan, I think, was a major figure in unleashing neoliberal capitalism and sort of markets free of regulation, going global and outsourcing workers and so forth.
The 9 most terrifying words I've ever heard.
That's right.
Yeah.
That as well.
I'm
the government, and
I'm here to help.
Government, I'm here to help.
And the thing is I was in the government at the time, and I was there to help. It was so infuriating when I heard those words. So go. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm ranting again.
And you made a good point earlier, Jill, that even though there are people say, well, Trump will not be able to be that authoritarian, even if he has the power of money behind and with him and so forth, because, and they're right, there are sort of legal complexities to just firing all kinds of workers, like civil servants in the EPA and so forth, or in the particularly scary is that he would just fire career lawyers in the Justice Department who are trying to keep some semblance of rule of law, and just put his own cronies in to prosecute you. He might not like KPFA and the way your media operates, and he's made very clear that he's going to... See, the thing about Trump that's a little bit different is that corporate power in the real deep state has always, in order to legitimate its role and disguise it, has always wanted a veneer of democracy. We talk a lot about this in the book, that democracy has appeared legitimate to Americans over history, despite their sort of awareness of big money, because there was some degree of free speech and civil liberties and so forth that were quite significant, and that is important. What Trump is doing is that it's not like he's doing anything new. He's bringing together class and caste, and we might want to talk about how he's brought those two things in a new marriage together, but he's stripping away that long historical veneer that was sort of, capitalists like to have a veneer. They don't want to be openly using the iron fist. Capitalism is always ruled by an iron fist and a velvet glove, and the velvet glove sort of masks the kind of brutality of corporate rule, and how, as you say, when you think about it, it just seems sort of absurd that money should be seen as having the rights of people, and most Americans don't like this idea that a billionaire class is basically going to be running the government. But I think that now Trump is sort of ripping that veneer away, and it's going to become much more obvious to people that big money is in charge. And it's just, if I can say something about the way the marriage of, the founding marriage of the deep class state and the deep caste state, the North and the South, is being revived, is in the way that this often happens in capitalist countries. If you think of country as a house. A capitalist house has an upstairs. It's an upstairs, downstairs house, and the upstairs is full of the 1% of very, very rich people living in luxury, and the 99% live downstairs or in the basement. And there's this issue, there's our stairways up to the top, and the idea of class says you can walk up the classway if you work hard, and it's a meritocracy, and you can end up on the top. But the actual chances of an American now moving up the stairs and getting toward the top is very low. About 50 or 60% of Americans, maybe a little bit more, will die in the same class they were born into. There's just not that kind of mobility, and the inequality between the upstairs and downstairs, has gotten bigger than even in the first.
Well, Bernie Sanders has said 3 men own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of this country, and it's time for a break. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the KSQD.org website. Our topic today is Who Owns Democracy? And we're speaking with Dr. Charles Derber, author of Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. Dr. Derber has written 26 books on politics, democracy, fascism, corporations, capitalism, climate change, war, the culture wars, culture and conversation, and social change. In addition, Dr. Derber writes for and has been reviewed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Truth Out, and other leading media. We'll be right back. Oh, and Dr. Derber, I want your take on Jim Hightower's commentary right after we play it. So we'll be right back after Jim Hightower's commentary titled, Trump's Plan to Feed the Greed of Corporate Elites. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Howard Lutnick wants to have his cake and eat it too. Then he intends to eat your cake. Lutnick is another billionaire corporate huckster who was a campaign bagman for Trump, and now he's to become the Commerce Secretary. But first, he's been tasked with picking hordes of corporate loyalists to be placed in Trump's government as friendly regulators of corporate hucksterism. Convenient, huh? This is what Trump and company mean by saying they'll make government efficient. Instead of corporate powers having to lobby regulators to get special favors, corporate officials will become the regulators. That is so much smoother for Lutnick and his ilk, who look forward to 4 freewheeling years of devouring our economy. In choosing those who are to police corporate price gouging, workplace rules, bank rip-offs, and such, Lutnick has been calling Wall Streeters, Silicon Valley tech bosses, corporate giants, and billionaires, telling them to send their best operatives to Trump's regime. Quote, let's get them into government, he exults. Notice that he's not calling any union leaders, consumer protectors, or other real public interest watchdogs. By the way, Lutnick himself is in line to profit from the corporate feeding frenzy he's now staffing. He is invested in everything from healthcare profiteers to cryptocurrency flimflams. And while he's been doing Trump's work, he's simultaneously been pushing Congress to do favors for his personal holdings. But, he insists, there is no conflict of interest in his efforts. After all, he explains with a straight face, he holds his government policy meetings in separate rooms from his own business pleadings. This is Jim Hightower saying, and that paper-thin wall of separation is Donald Trump's new ethical standard for protecting us from raw corporate greed. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is made possible by you subscribers to Jim Hightower's Lowdown on Substack. Find us at jimhightower.substack.com.
If you are just joining us, our topic today is Who Owns Democracy? And our bold guest is Dr. Charles Derber, who is a professor of sociology at Boston College. Now, Dr. Derber, in his commentary, Jim Hightower mentioned the greed of corporate elites. After listening to that commentary, did any thoughts or reactions come to mind?
Well, I think he's right on. I mean, I think the irony here is that Trump got elected by workers who have been continuing to migrate from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And Trump won over these workers by saying that he was going to be their man to bring America back to, the forgotten worker and the outsourcing of these globalizing elites. He ran against the elites and the government that he said was sort of permitting this kind of global, theft to take place. The irony is that, as Hightower is saying, he's actually enriching the whole basis of the Trump agenda is enriching the real deep state. I mean, Trump's regime is more explicit. I mean, the corporate deep state that Hightower is talking about now, there's nothing new at all about it. It's just that we have in power a man who claimed to be attacking the deep state, but he's actually enriching it. And if I could go back just for a second to the idea of an upstairs, downstairs house, which is another way of
I like that analogy very much, yes.
So if you live upstairs, how do you, the real threat is people living downstairs. As things get worse downstairs and, things get better upstairs, the biggest fear if you live upstairs is how do we keep these people downstairs from suddenly scratching their head and saying, why are we working 2 or 3 jobs and these guys are living off their stock? How, we might face a real, revolution here. I mean, some sort of people saying we want to take control of the house. The way that capitalists have always solved this problem of living upstairs in a transparently, downstairs house being, getting more and more into the basement, is you're saying, look, you want to divide and conquer. The only way to keep the house intact as an upstairs, downstairs house is to divide the downstairs. And how do you divide the downstairs? Well, the most convenient way, which has been long part of that history we were talking about, is by race. And you can say, if we can find a way to say that the real Americans, the people who are really belong downstairs and deserve the pride and privilege of being in this American house, are, basically, we'll go after the immigrants who are clearly belong in some other house and are not part of us. And then there are what Trump calls, repeatedly the enemy within. And in talking that way, he's using the old language of the Southern deep state, the sort of racial kind of what we call in the book American fascist approach. And while the word fascism may seem hyperbolic, it's worth noting that Hitler was really impressed by the American racial codes of the Jim Crow and sent his scientists to study America because he felt like if he could understand how the racial divisions, let's say to keep the metaphor going, in the upstairs, downstairs house, if he could find out how that worked to keep parts of the people in the downstairs happy, united with the people in the upstairs, he could run his own German, very authoritarian kind of government. So in a funny way, we're not emulating European classical fascism in this new white Christian nationalism that Reagan really played on. And there's a long history of this going up to Trump with his enemy within and his attack on immigrants and people of color and so forth. It's basically a way of using caste, in other words, racial division and racial identity, as a way to basically solidify the really bizarre connection between the billionaires on top who are running Trump regime, who flocked in droves both toward Reagan and ever more toward Trump, toward the billionaire class, because they thought he was speaking for them. He was going to help the people at the bottom. And the thing that's really important to notice about this, in thinking about change, Jill, is that I think the real earthquake of American politics in the last 50 years is with the end of the New Deal and between the 30s and the 60s, when you had a fairly progressive class kind of politics going on in the United States, although it was very compromised by war and militarism. you did have a kind of, you had what Roosevelt identified with unions. You had a really spontaneous, huge labor movement. About 48% of Americans became part of unions. Do you know, Jill, what percentage of Americans are in unions today?
I think it's about 11%.
Yeah, in the private sector, it's 6%. So, I mean, this is part of a dynamic where, Trump has found a trick to persuade working class people that he's on their side when he's building the most anti-worker corporate deep state that we've seen in a long time.
His trick is propaganda. It's just...
Yes, and it's also here. It's that the Democratic Party has opened the door wide for precisely this change, and that has to do with the fact, which we write about a lot in this book, that the Democratic Party has shifted away from the New Deal's focus on the economy
That's
and
right.
the way economic division toward these kind of siloed identity politics, whether they're related to race. I mean, these are very important issues, obviously, around race and gender and so forth, but the Democratic Party has, and you saw this very much in the Harris campaign, it was really a disaster. They've moved toward embracing, this started with Bill Clinton, and Obama actually perpetuated a lot of this too, where basically you had the Democratic Party turning progressivism away from these economic, the real fundamental divisions between the upstairs and the downstairs, and sort of themselves seizing on a kind of identity politics which divided these people in the downstairs from each other. And so the Democratic Party has been abandoning the name, the real interests of these workers in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, the blue wall states. These are very industrial states that got hit very hard by global outsourcing and by the loss of unions and the loss of secure jobs. And the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris and the Democrats really, since Bill Clinton, have been running away from these class issues and running toward identity politics in a very siloed form. And by siloed, I mean sort of issues sort of very much limited to particular groups that actually end up dividing them more. I mean, Korean Americans get into conflicts with Black Americans and race, and it sort of feeds the identity politics that Trump peddles, which is to white workers saying, basically the Democrats are basically sympathizing with all these people who are not working hard or not really true Americans. They're not religious. They're not Christian. They're not, they're not really citizens. And so it's really important when you try to think about how do we challenge the deep state to, first of all, understand who the deep state really is, and that we're talking about largely about a corporate elite that Trump is part of rather than assaulting. And second, that the Democratic Party has become an appendage of the deep state itself in many ways. I think Harris did so badly because she never really challenged the power and control of corporate America and of capitalism in our system. She kept saying, in fact, I can quote her over and over again, she says, I'm a, quote, proud capitalist. She never talked about raising the minimum wage, really stopping out, really challenging exactly what we've been talking about, all the multifarious, absurd ways in which corporate America is gouging and fleecing ordinary Americans and using the government, the whole fiction of government as sort of a free market, whereas in fact the largest form of corporate welfare in the United States, is corporate welfare. It's billions of dollars going to the military-industrial complex, to the carbon industrial complex.
The fossil fuel industry?
The fossil fuel industry.
We still subsidize them.
Generally. Yeah.
I wonder, though, Dr. Derber, and just before the break, I was going to ask, I wonder how much with the Democrats moving away from the positions of the middle class was due to the Supreme Court's decision about making money speech and giving free speech rights to corporations, and that they had to, and corporations have personhood. It seems to me that they were forced to go find the money as the union membership was suppressed. Maybe it's, as you say, 6% in the private, but I think maybe around 11% with public public and private, when that's all been suppressed, dried up money on the union side, and we're forced to go the corporation side, which means towing the corporate line. Okay, on to a break here. I'm speaking with our bold interview guest, Dr. Charles Derber of Boston College, and you're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, and 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Stay tuned tonight on KSQD for State of Mind, hosted by Santa Cruz licensed psychotherapist Deborah Sloss. This month she takes a look at the overlooked struggles of mothers supporting adult children with mental health and addiction challenges, balancing unconditional love with setting boundaries and preserving their own well-being requires immense resilience. Psychotherapist and author Judy Smith shares research on mothers who navigate these challenges later in life. Kathy Pereira, a mother and support group leader, shares her lived experience and practical insights. They discuss the support needed to help these mothers not just survive, but thrive. That's State of Mind this evening, Sunday at 6 p.m. here on KSQD 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5 FM and KSQD.org.
We're back, and we're speaking with our bold guest, Dr. Charles Derber. Now, Dr. Derber, I want to ask you about what we might keep doing, stop doing, start doing. It's a difference between what you talk about as shallow democracy and deep democracy. So, back to you.
I think that it's important. We talk a lot in the book about what the meaning of democracy is. And we've always had, because of the power of money and the way it's mobilized racial division in the work class and so forth, there's always been a pretty shallow democracy. And we talk in the book about what it means what is a real democracy, where money is not running the show, but ordinary people really are having a voice and really having a lot of influence over what the government does. And what I believe for a long time, in which we developed in this book, as I have in prior books on, corporate power, is that you can't really have a political democracy without sort of creating a real role for people in the running of the economy, in their workplace, and if corporations basically exclusive control over jobs where they are investing their money, where the country's capital is going, the conditions of labor. There's, the money is going to, flow in through all kinds of ways into the government and into the political process. And you're never, even if you have voting and, all the veneer of democracy, you're not going to have a real government representing the people. So a deep democracy, meaning a durable, really meaningful democracy, is one that sort of empowers people in the economy, sort of a more participatory democracy in which workers have a real say over their over the basic economic decisions that are being made in the country. In Europe, with the social democracy, the Europeans after World War II, they realized all their spending on war was creating collective suicide. They let America do all that, and they rededicated themselves to building they realized that companies in the imperial process in Europe, the colonialism, had basically weakened the ordinary people to the degree that they wanted to try to create a different kind of society. And after World War II, they really were able to build a kind of economy which it's often called social democracy. It's sometimes called democratic. Bernie Sanders sometimes talks about many European countries as democratic socialism. But the idea of it is that if you want real political democracy, it's always going to be hijacked unless you have a kind of economic democracy, meaning in Europe, by law in Germany, for example, workers have to have 50% of elected representatives on the board of any big company, over 500 workers, even if they own no stock. It's just they're seen as an essential sort of stakeholder in the company, and so they're entitled to that voice. But that's only one of about 5 major ways. About 70% of European workers are unionized. They have strong union representatives. We have two business parties. They have a labor party. They have workers' councils, which are legally mandated. If you work in a human resources department or any department in a big company, the law requires that this is independent of the unions, you have worker councils where managers of the department have to negotiate everything from hours of work to the color of the walls to, vacation time with the working people in that department. And then you have national bargaining between the government, which is often run by the Labor Party, a Labor Party, and the companies, so that you have workers have these multiple layers of input into, are you going to have jobs here or are you going to have them, outsourced to other parts of the world? What kind of wages, what kind of job training are you going to have? And it's led to a much more robust kind of economic voice for ordinary people. And that, in turn, has opened the door to a much wider spectrum of political voices, whether you have Green parties or Labor parties or, very far left parties. And these parties came together, for example, in France in a coalition when it looked like Le Pen and the French fascists might come in, and were able to basically stop it. And this is just a little, snippet of a much larger story about if you want real democracy, you can't separate it from giving people control over the money. I mean, this is the thing that Harris and the Democrats really paid no attention to at all. They just didn't challenge most Americans are aware that big money matters. If you allow enormous concentrations of capital at the top of the house or, in the 1%, and as you said, there are about 10 billionaires in America who have more money than most people on most continents. You just have this sickening concentration of wealth. It's larger than it was in the first Gilded Age. And I don't think there's ever been this much concentration of money in a tiny number of people in the history of the world.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk, who is garnering billions from the government, is on track. He has about $350 billion. His money's gone up since Trump. It will continue to go up, and Bloomberg has said he will now be the world's first trillionaire, and he's going to have his hands on a lot of political power. The road between, business and money and power in the government has never been clearer and more obscene than it's going to be in this Trump crony capitalism. So I think the lesson of this is that we do, the Democrats, Trump won by attacking what he called the deep state, but actually enriching and empowering the real deep state. People who want to change the country have got to realize who the real deep state is and how much it's vested in these large financial, incredible concentrations of power.
So that could be a start doing is understanding who
the real deep state is and how Trump is actually enriching and empowering the very deep state that he claimed that he was assaulting. It would lead to a new kind of politics. I think particularly in the Democratic Party, as I said, the Democrats have been complicit in opening the door to Trumpist kinds of ideas of power, and by highlighting caste issues in a way that pull people's attention away from the underlying economic interests that they share with each other.
Well, in the minute we have left, do you have any ideas of things that we should keep doing or stop doing?
Well, I think that people, everybody feels incredibly demoralized, and I understand that. But
yes.
I think there's just, I'm in a university, I'm seeing, people just shut down in terms of all over the country, in terms of feeling they can be, actually say the things in class that students can go out and protest. I think that, once you understand who you're really dealing with, the agency of the deep state and how it's operating through the Trump regime now, I do think there's a lot you can do at every level, starting with, locally and, in your community, groups like Indivisible or Get Social or even online groups where people simply cling together for some shared grief about what's happened, and there's lots to grieve. At the same time, to begin building those connections and those movements. I work with a lot of young people who are students, and the Gen Z movements around gun violence and climate and war with the Gaza war, and you could go on. You've got a revived labor movement with Sean Fain and these people. The big thing there is that the labor movement, for the first time in American history, has really become an anti-war movement. The problem with the earlier labor movements were that they were buying into the Cold War, and so their critique of the system was very muted. Now you have a labor movement that's much more, and you got labor, in the universities.
Dr. Derber,
are organizing the students. So.
We've run out of time. I wish I had more time with you, because I wanted to really ask, who does own democracy? And I guess it's us. And what we're going to do.
It's gonna be us. Yeah.
Thank you for being our bold and impressive guest today. Thank you for an hour of your valuable time. I really appreciate you being here. Yes.
Thanks so much for having me again.
You're welcome. You've written a brilliant book.
Thank you very much.
You may find Dr. Charles Derber's numerous books anywhere that fine books are sold. What's up next on Be Bold America? Please join us on Sunday, December 15th for State of the Free Press 2025, the top censored stories and media analysis of 2023 and 2024. In their new book, Project Censored highlights the vital stories that corporate media underreported, exposes rampant news abuse, and tracks emerging threats against the press from financial and political powers. Every year, Project Censored publishes its State of the Free Press, which takes the pulse of the media and shares the 25 most important but underreported stories of the past year. We will be interviewing Shaylee Voidal to take this look back on the year with the significant news stories that lost out to coverage of celebrities and non-events. Tragically, 2024 also stands out as the year that corporate media failed to adequately cover Israel's ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people and the threat it poses to the whole world. With their gaze trained elsewhere, the powerful got a pass from the very institution that should hold them to account. So please join me for State of the Free Press 2025 on Be Bold America, Sunday, December 15th at 5 p.m. As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as YouTube and on the KSQD website. Please visit and subscribe for free. I want to give a special thank you to Be Bold America's talented program engineer, Eliza James, and you are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz and KSQT Prunedale. Many voices, one station. Listen worldwide online as ksqd.org. Stay tuned for State of Mind with Deborah Sloss. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start.